The film opens by introducing a family, George, Anne, their son Georgie, and their dog Lucky, as they drive to their lake house for a holiday. George had a serene, classical piece of music playing in the car, but Anne switched the CD to a much louder selection. During their drive, they encountered their neighbor, Fred, who was accompanied by two young men dressed in white, whom Anne correctly suspected were golfers. When Anne asked Fred how he was, his response was oddly reserved. Anne requested that Fred come over to help with George's boat, and he promised to arrive in about 20 minutes. Anne voiced her suspicion about Fred's strange behavior and the two unfamiliar young men, but George dismissed her concerns, advising her not to overthink it. A short while later, Fred arrived at their house with one of the young men, whom he introduced as Paul, the son of a friend. After they all successfully launched George's boat into the water, they departed, leaving George and Georgie to work on the boat. Meanwhile, as Anne was cooking in the kitchen, the other young man, Peter, approached the house. He claimed he was Fred's friend's son and that they had run out of eggs. Anne was accommodating and gave him 4 eggs. However, Peter clumsily dropped the eggs on the floor. Anne, frustrated, cleaned up the mess and asked what he planned to do now. Peter simply requested more eggs, and Anne reluctantly agreed to give him 4 more. As Anne was retrieving the eggs, Peter deliberately knocked her mobile phone into the sink, ruining it. Anne, angered by this, handed him the eggs and firmly told him to leave immediately. She lit a cigarette to calm down, and at that moment, she heard the dog barking. She went outside and found Lucky barking at Peter and Paul. She quieted the dog, but Peter then claimed that the dog's barking had caused him to drop the new batch of 4 eggs as well, and he demanded more. Paul, noticing a golf club in Anne's house, expressed his admiration for it, grabbed it, and headed outside. Simultaneously, George and Georgie, while working on the boat, heard their dog bark loudly, followed by an abrupt silence. Sensing something was wrong, they returned to the house. Inside, Anne was trying to physically force Paul and Peter out as they refused to leave. George arrived and demanded an explanation. Paul immediately blamed Anne. Anne furiously told George to throw them out. When George told them to go, they ignored him, prompting George to slap Paul. In immediate retaliation, Paul used the golf club to savagely strike George's knee, injuring him badly. Paul warned Georgie not to scream, which quieted the terrified boy. The family, now held captive, demanded they leave, but the 2 men remained. Anne asked Paul about the dog, and he cryptically revealed he had killed Lucky. Anne later found the dog's body in the car. Sometime after, the family's neighbors arrived, intending to visit the vacationers. Paul threatened to kill everyone if Anne tried any trick. He then took Anne out to meet the neighbors. Anne lied, telling them Paul was a relative, and after a brief conversation, the neighbors left. That night, Paul and Peter forced the family to play a game, with Paul betting that all 3 of them would be dead by 9 a.m. the next morning. George offered Paul a large sum of money, begging him to state his price and leave them alone. Paul cruelly explained that he wasn't doing this for money, but because he enjoyed it. Paul and Peter then started taunting Anne about her body, demanding she strip naked so they could see how thin she was. Anne vehemently refused, but Georgie started crying upon hearing his mother being insulted. Paul covered Georgie's head with a cloth so he wouldn't see his mother humiliated. The 2 men then renewed their demand, forcing a terrified Anne to strip. They expressed their pleasure at the sight before allowing her to get dressed again. Afterward, Peter removed the cloth from Georgie's face. The boy seized the chance and fled the house. Paul immediately tied Anne's hands and feet before giving chase. Georgie tried to climb the gate but failed, so he ran to Fred's house and hid. Meanwhile, back at the house, Anne desperately pleaded with Peter for her family's lives, but he was unmoved. At Fred's house, Georgie found a gun and, horrifyingly, the corpses of his neighbors in the bathroom, confirming that Paul and Peter were murderers. Georgie hid with the gun, but Paul soon found him. Georgie pointed the weapon at him and tried to shoot, but it failed to fire. Paul captured him, brought him back to the house, and told George his son had tried to kill him with a gun. Georgie told his parents about the bodies of Fred and his wife, confirming the identity of their attackers. Paul then asked them who wished to die first and played a counting out game that ended with Anne. Paul went to the kitchen for a snack, and suddenly a gunshot was heard. Peter had shot and killed Georgie. When Paul returned, he was mildly irritated, asking Peter why he had killed Georgie, as it was supposed to be Anne's turn. Peter explained that Georgie had tried to escape. Peter and Paul then locked the house and left. Anne managed to get up, go to the kitchen, and use a knife to free herself. She then helped untie George, and they both wept over their son's death. George, unable to walk, urged Anne to go for help alone. Anne quickly dressed and tried to turn on her phone, but it wouldn't work because Peter had dropped it in the sink. She used a hairdryer to dry it, and the phone briefly powered on. She tried calling the police, but the line was silent. George insisted she leave immediately. Anne went to seek help while George desperately tried to speak to the police, but his voice was not transmitted due to the damaged phone. Anne ran onto the road and saw a car approaching. Fearing it was Paul and Peter, she hid behind a tree. As the car passed, she saw it wasn't them. She tried to flag it down, but it was too far ahead. She then saw another car coming and waved her arms. Inside the house, George was covering his son's body when he heard the door open. He thought Anne had returned with help. Instead, it was Paul and Peter, who had captured Anne in the second car. Paul tied up Anne and George again, asking Anne if she'd prefer to be killed with a knife or a gun. Anne grabbed the gun and shot Peter dead. Paul, seemingly shocked, searched for the TV remote. He found it and pressed the rewind button, and the movie's timeline literally reversed, bringing Peter back to life. When Anne tried to shoot Peter again, Paul stopped her this time. Paul then used the same gun to shoot and kill George, leaving Anne as the sole survivor. Daylight broke, and Paul and Peter tied Anne up, put her on the boat, and began sailing on the lake. Just before 9 a.m., Paul pushed Anne into the river, drowning her. Afterward, they drove to the house of the female neighbor, the same woman who had visited Anne and George earlier. Paul asked her for eggs, claiming Anne had sent him. As the woman went inside to fetch the eggs, Paul stood there with a chillingly enigmatic look on his face, and the film ended on that disturbing note.